All right, peace, blessings, ache, love, family, all the good stuff in life, especially after this hard past year that we've all undergone. Again, thank you for the introduction, Dennis Febo. This presentation I constructed as a TED Talk. It was performed in 2016, so if you want to see the original TED Talk, it's a condensed version of what I'm going to do today. We'll go into seeing the performative aspect of it. Today, I'm going to touch on the points and kind of go into a little bit more depth so that we extend. We know that this conversation is direly needed. The conversation of race, of racism, structural racism. I mean, it permeates literally every single thing that we're doing in this country, right? I'm also a professor at New Jersey City University. I teach cultural competency to our health science students. And I find it very interesting as I'm negotiating with the class and coming up with standards and definitions as to why it is that we use the language that we use. Not just with them, with inmates that I work with at the Hudson County Correctional Facility that I've been working with for the past 8 years, with juveniles in the juvenile detention system, with professionals across, I mean, I've literally in every field that I've gone in and I do this presentation, it really blows my mind how much we don't know. And we're using building blocks to have conversations, but we never define the block, right? So the purpose of this presentation is to go a little bit into the purpose, the history of the words. And I wanted to open up with saying that we all, and I hope we do, understand the power of words, right? And when a word is applied to yourself, it takes that much more importance. Too many of us are walking around, and I'm going to say especially our youth, because our youth are in their identity formative stages, that if they don't have the necessary information to build that proper foundation for identity, they are going to be lost. And for as many of the youth that I've worked with in this system, I knew the solution was to help them find who they truly were, not just in themselves individually, historically, because many of the pictures of what our story is as a people, as continents, as cultures, come from the point of perspective of trauma and oppression, and we tend to ignore the greatness that comes from our ancestry. And if I don't have the greatness as an availability to my identity, then all I can rest on is the trauma, right? So the point of this workshop is to kind of break those things down and hopefully formulate something that when we're using these words in conversation as vocabulary, that we're a little bit more strengthened in how we're going to actually get a message across. All right. So first and foremost, when we're talking about history as a perspective, history as being subjective, how it was written, how it's presented. I know many of us growing up learned about how Christopher Columbus discovered America, and he was a great American hero, right? A lot of us grew up learning about all the contributions that white people have made in the United States, but tend to eliminate the contributions of people of color. I literally just found out last year that Puerto Ricans helped free Mobile, Alabama, Jackson, Mississippi, and the state of Florida during the American Revolution. And it took me as a grown man now, still doing my research, finding these little bits of, I would say, nuggets or gems of information, because when you know a piece of information like that, as a Puerto Rican, I feel a whole lot more comfortable when I sit in a room when everyone's calling themselves an American, because I understand that my ancestors contributed to the fact that we're sitting at this table. But again, if the information is omitted, or it only comes from one platform or one stand of understanding, then we will never be able to escape. Because all we're using is using the same blocks to go on a circular argument over and over and over, and this is why we can't resolve. But if we wanted to resolve and end racism, then we have to be really, really real. We have to be as real as the understanding of what our ultimate identity may be, And what are all the other intricacies that come down from it? That depending on what identity labels I associate to, gives me more status and more access in society versus no status and no access in society. When we're having conversations about racism, I need everyone to understand, delete the word out your mind. You're not speaking about race, you're speaking about humanity. When someone says that they believe that they're a superior race, they're saying that they're more human than you. And when someone says that you're part of a race that doesn't belong, what they're saying is that you're not human. When someone goes through a racist experience, don't we go, damn, that was racist, and damn. But what was really happening? It could have been a look, it could have been a word, it could have been the way you were being stared at, it could have been the way you were dressed. And for those of us that undergo it on a daily basis, we understand. For those of us that don't undergo it on a daily basis, we would never understand. And this is why we enter this big battlefield that we have here in the current US political climate. All right. When we look at the word race and we look and hear etymology, and I talk to my college students all the time about the power of etymology, the study of the roots of words. I've looked up words like love, friendship, relationship, human. Where do these words come from? How did our ancestors use them? And how did they develop over time to have the meanings associated to them that we give them? And when I started talking about my own personal identity, say as a Puerto Rican, I started to ask, what do those words mean? And when you translate the words Puerto Rico to English, they mean rich port. And I said, I don't know no rich Puerto Ricans. I know I ain't rich. So what is this richness they're speaking of? And I thought this was an island. I thought it was a country. I thought it was a nation, not a port of entry and departure. The title of the word itself is speaking on the colonization of the land, the colonization of the mind, and the colonization of the body. This is why Puerto Ricans can say we're Boricua, which speaks to our indigenousness of the land. So we have a dual identity on top of the fact that we're American citizens. Now we got a triple one. So for someone who's Puerto Rican, who has the ability to rest on all these different identities, how do these identities and what access points do you have as an individual? And once you are declared in such paths, what access do they give you? Does it help me to put that I'm Puerto Rican on a mortgage application? Does it help me to put down that I'm Puerto Rican on an insurance application or a life insurance application or a car insurance application? And I know the answer to that is absolutely not. The more melanin you have in your skin, the less probability, look it up, family, you will have of getting any of these chances. And it's funny because all they're really doing is asking you a question, and what are you doing? You're checking a box. And because you check that box, you put yourself in a status that does not give you access. So where is this all going? That when we have levels of status without access, then what's the point of resting in such status? All right. When we look up the word race, the etymology of it, it goes really far back, and it meant a race of people, a family, clans. And I want you to think that as the further back you start to go in history, the less population there was on planet Earth. So you have very few people trying to define and identify by constructs that then do not and did not have the same meaning that we hold today. Fast forward from the 1400s all the way to 2021. What do these words mean? Why do we use them? Who came up with them? Why do we have to use them? Right? And these are the questions that I bring up throughout this conversation. So race just meant clan or family, but eventually started to take on other meanings and other words. Today in 2021, when we refer to race, we're speaking of phenotypic aspects of your body. Phenotypic meaning of the physical appearance, skin, eye color, hair texture. That's it. That's what race is. All right. Then we have ethnicity. Ethnicity means of your cultural background. right? So I can define my culture, I can define my race, and most importantly, your nationality, right? And I tell you, I do this all the time. I do intake applications and I write race, ethnicity, nationality, fill them out, and watch people scratch their head trying to figure out, how do you answer these questions? We throw the words around so loosely. We do it in parties, where my black people at? Hey! But when it comes to understanding and defining why we use that word, we don't have access. And we're not really versed in it because none of our educational institutions really sat us down and taught us it. When we look at an ism could be any practice, any system, or any philosophy attached to, and here we're going to say, a science. Why would something scientific, an ism, be associated to a non-scientific concept? See, it was a scientific concept all the way up to the year 2000. And I don't know if everybody remembers when they decoded the Human Genome Project and Bill Clinton stood in front of the world and proudly announced that there was no such thing as race, as human beings were more than 99.9% the same. When I heard that, I cheered. I got excited. Wow, we don't have to use this no more? Like, it's really not real. It's not science. But this was 2000. What ended up happening in 2001? 9/11. 9/11 happened, and now it started to become okay to stereotype, to be racist, to say these things out loud against our Muslim brothers and sisters. And as time has gone on since 2001, all the way up until today, we've come up with a whole lot of more terms, organizations, identity labels, and structures to try to deal with the concept of identity and humanization. Still, 2021, when in 1776 they wrote all men were created equal, why are we still debating this? Because we know that there's an understanding that the connection of those words did not imply any colonized populations in the United States. Till today, Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States. For anyone that preaches democracy and not understand that American citizens cannot vote for their president, cannot vote for the judges, cannot vote for their Congress people to have a voice in Congress. But we all put pressure on each other to sure vote for Biden in November. And for everyone that cast their vote and posted to put pressure on other people to vote themselves, not once did we speak about the illegal second-class citizenship status that Puerto Ricans have. It's not just Puerto Ricans, Mariana Islands, the Virgin Islands, and Guam. 8 million citizens of the United States of America who do not have the access to the vote. So we live in a paradox and we live in a contradiction. Not just on national identity, nationalization, and where you get your civil rights from, but now I'm talking natural law, the law of God, your relationship of spirit to the earth, where all law comes from, which is why a judge must put their hand on a Bible, which is why when a president gets sworn in, he must put his hand on a Bible showing the spiritual oath. So how do we go from there to having the system that we have? And there's a lot of conversation on whether racism is what I called you a word or racism is systemic. And we're going to get a little further into that. The race and the ism, all right? When you combine them, you get racism, the science of race, right? And when did race become a science? Which institutions in this country validated race as a scientific concept? I'll start Harvard, MIT, Yale, the Museum of Natural History, the Smithsonian, the White House. All validated race as a scientific construct. But where did the science begin? While it might have gone further back in the time when we talk about the Spanish and the Portuguese landing in the Americas, first things first, we need to set the tone. What is the importance of subjugating melanated people? What was the reason to subjugate people with melanin in their skin? The simple answer was only melanated people could stand in the sun. That was it. It had nothing to do with intelligence, behavior, any other construct within being a human being, but the fact that your skin can block you from the sun. You can stand longer during the day in a field and generate more profit. So if that's the case, then why is it today we have almost just as many black men behind bars during the peak of slavery in 1864? And why are those melanated bodies now behind walls getting no sun? And why is it that this system completely monetarily benefits in the trillions from such system? From 1864, when we look at the state of Mississippi having the most millionaires per square mile on the face of the earth. Fast forward till today, now we have one of the wealthiest corporations globe, Geo Group, Core Civic, and every other private prison company in the world. When we're talking about structures and we're talking about racism, we need to understand how the science crossed with the law. Because we're one of the few countries in the entire globe that has any mention of race in any of our coding of law. If I'm standing dead smack in the middle of the country of India and I'm an Indian person, does race matter? Do you think people in the middle of any specific country where there isn't a plethora of diversity are sitting around discussing the scientific intricacies of skin color? We are the few countries in the world that still does it. I mean, we find it prevalent around the world, but we're one of the few ones that have it in the forefront of every single political, social, and economic conversation. All right? So I want you to learn that back in 1776, and I'm going to share my screen, you had these two guys right here. Blumenbach was the most famous one, Johann Blumenbach. If anybody knows who the platypus as an animal, Johann Blumenbach named the platypus. They're called naturalists. Naturalists were people who categorize animals as genus and species, i.e. Homo sapien. But these two men were really bent on trying to figure out if skin color and where you came from on planet Earth had any impact on your behavior and your intelligence. While then it might have been a fair question, when you look at the scientific approach that they took, they made sure to put themselves in such caste system at the top, right? So here's Blumenbach's model. And he did this by measuring phrenology, feeling skulls of dead bodies, right? So when he died and they went in his home, there were mountains of human skulls found in his apartment. And all that man did was sit down and try to categorize skulls to figure out which categories he could make up for human beings. And these are the 5 racial categorizations that he invented. Caucasian for white, Mongolian for yellow, American for red, Malay for brown, and Ethiopian for black. What he said is that Caucasians were the purest form of human beings, and that because of life choices, behavior, and environment would degrade your skin and your physical appearance, the lowest being black. He also argued that if black people worked hard enough, they could go back to being white again. This is the birth of what we call race and scientific racism, founded in the year 1776. And what else happened in the year 1776? The foundation of this country. So George Washington, he's scrolling on Instagram. He sees what the Germans are posting. Oh, this race stuff. Oh, this sounds perfect because it allows me to justify why I had so many slaves as the first president of the United States. Not only that, acknowledged the evil and the immorality of slavery, but knew that if I freed them, my wife, after I would pass away, would not be able to sustain herself, therefore kept them in perpetuity until his wife's death and they freed those slaves. He's just one. Go down the list of the founders of this country and you'll find that most of them subscribe to these ideologies. and they use them to justify the ability to make profit off of free labor on melanated bodies. If anything starts US History 101, that's where it should begin, because it explains why we're still having this conversation all the way up until today. All right. Therefore, if race is a science as an ism, then any practitioner, believer, subscriber, or student or teacher of race is known as a racist. The same way you are a biology teacher, you are a biologist, chemist. Any ist at the end of the day is a specialist in the field. So would this mean that if I call myself by a race, now that I know, now that I've read, now that I can put the face to the name, this man has nothing to do with my life. This man has nothing to do with your life. He made these things in order to justify their superiority. Why would I continue to use their structure? So if I use the structure, am I a racist? Am I a believer of the science? See, when the news came out in 2000, a lot of us missed it. The news came out in 2000 and said that it was no longer a science. If you look up race on dictionary.com, it says in parentheses right next to it, no longer in technical use. What? So why are you still asking me to check in on applications? Why are we having discussions about it? We understand that they're the repercussions of what these inventions were. But at the same time, if I remain in the structure, I can never escape it. Now, when we start to get to the intricacies of it, right? Here's your boy George Washington and his slaves in the field and his plantation, and basically everyone down the line, all right? Now, I want to get real quick into the explanation of the different categorizations that we hear, all right? And then I'm going to go back to it. When we look at applications now, this is what we usually see. White, Caucasian, Black, African American, Asian, Hispanic, Latino, and Native American, all right? But when we look at Blumenbach's model, I think it's kind of funny because when we talk about the rest of the world looking at the United States, when you say American, most people think Caucasian, right? But when we look at the racial breakdown, why are Caucasian and American two separate races? And one had no association to the other. Now we fast forward. Native American came from the red, the Native Americans of this land. The first dictionary entry, Webster's Dictionary, first edition, has American defined as coppered-colored people. Coppered-colored people. That's the true definition of an American. And it went from Greenland and Alaska all the way down to Tierra del Fuego in Argentina. Thus why we call it North and South America. So if you're Brazilian, you're American. You're Argentinian, you're American. You're Guyanese, you're American. You're Mexican, you're American. So why do we hyphenate? What the hell is a Mexican American? They're the first Americans. Why are we hyphenating their name after the fact? This goes to show how much we get plugged away from our humanity. Because what other identities, what other people around the world walk around with hyphenated identities? Not knowing if we're black or we're brown or we're white. And then have to get into the standard discussions. Greenland, Alaska, all the way to Tierra del Fuego, Argentina, the entire Western Hemisphere is known as America. All right? But if credit is given to discoverers of land and water, then how come we're not called Colombians? Right? We go anywhere else around the world. Whatever man was given credit to discovering that land or that water, those people call themselves by that man's name. But for some reason, here in the United States of America, as we celebrate a federal holiday every October under Christopher Columbus's name, but none of us call ourselves Colombians. But when we look back in the story, isn't our nation's capital called the Washington District of Columbia? You bunch of Colombians, you. Because here we're speaking on, there was some kind of disconnect, right? And this disconnect, there's a couple of theories, but if we're going to go by the status quo theory, that Amerigo Vespucci, who was another Italian man, discovered that Columbus did not discover, family, we need to understand, Columbus never knew he landed in America. Columbus thought he was in India, even after he died believing he was in India. This is why we call Native Americans Indians. Right? So fast forward, Amerigo Vespucci, who's a cartographer, he's sailing, he's drawing a map, and he finds in comparison that this was not India, that this was a whole new land altogether, so credit was given to him on the naming of the map. So as an American, you call yourself by the name of a man that discovered that a man made a mistake in his discoveries. That is what we identify. You identify by a man's name. And most people don't even know who Amerigo Vespucci is, yet they kill someone in the name of America. So there's this thing called simulacrum and simulation. I can simulate you because I'm watching you. I can mimic what you're doing. But now if I copy the copy, it becomes ingenuine. And what we are as an identity is a copy of a copy. And because the copy of the copy was defined by people who thought themselves to be superior, in the very definitions themselves of race, we find superiority and inferiority, and we will never get rid of them. Because that was the intention of the definition to begin with. All right. If we fast forward, here we got people from India, halfway across the world, have no relationship to anyone in the Western Hemisphere, yet you call them by the same name. If I was giving this workshop and half the room was Native American and the other half was from India, and I shouted, "Where my Indians at?" there's going to be a lot of confused people. Now fast forward. Now we say white or the Caucasian. And I do this all the time, and I kind of love it because it just kind of goes to show I'm in a room full of white people. Raise your hand if you're a Caucasian. Everyone raises their hand. We here know what that word means. Nobody keeps their hand up. So if Caucasian in this model is supposed to be the superior one, how come we don't even know where it comes from? Now, if I told you it came from the Caucasus Mountains, can you guarantee your lineage comes from those mountains? Any Caucasian on this earth is a resident of the Caucasus Mountains. The word Caucasus itself means mountain. But if you live in the valley in LA, you ain't never been up in a mountain, how are you Caucasian? If you can't trace your family history to those mountains, which today are the present day countries of Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia, how are you a Caucasian? So Native American ain't a race because it's not alluding to skin color. Caucasian is not a race because it also does not allude to skin color. It is alluding to a geographic region of the earth. Whiteness and Caucasian are two separate things. As a matter of fact, when Blumenbach defined Caucasian, he gave some leeway for people from India and Saudi Arabia because he noticed that their skulls were also very similar to those that came from the Caucasus Mountains. I don't know if you guys know a lot of Indian people here in Jersey City. We got India Square. You got Indian people that are blacker than some Afro-Americans from the US. So Caucasian is neither white. It could be white or it can be black. As a matter of fact, it was used in a Supreme Court ruling in 1921 as Indians from India were trying to gain naturalization in the United States of America, and the Supreme Court ruled that they were not Caucasian, that it had to be Caucasian white. Caucasian does not mean white, and it is not a race. All right. Then we got Asia. 2/3 of the, it just bugs me out when I get to this part of it. 2/3 of the world's population. If I'm in a room and there's 2/3 of people, we all of the majority. We all Asian, right? 2/3 of the world's population, 1/3 of the Earth's landmass are Asian, from Afghanistan, Iraq, Russia, Sri Lanka, the Philippines, Japan. China, Mongolia. These are all very different cultures, countries, and it is a huge mass of land. Asian means nothing. There's nothing that alludes to any cultural groupings. There's nothing that alludes to skin color. And there's nothing that could allude to language because more than 2,000 dialects are spoken in Asia. If we're going to define something, it must be concrete. It must be within the border and the boundary of such definition. So what is an Asian? Asian comes from the word Asua, the etymology of it, which was Asia Minor or Western Turkey. And as Alexander the Great started conquering the East, and he went as far as he got to India, he kept calling it Asia. So when a Chinese person affirms themselves as an Asian, they're calling themselves by the name and the land and the people halfway across the world from them that they have no direct relationship to. Asian is not a race. You can find the darkest Asians to the lightest Asians. It has nothing to do with physical appearance. All right. Then we go to African, or here, as Blumenbach called it, Ethiopian. Everyone needs to understand Africa is the cradle of human civilization. The oldest stories and almost pretty much every religion, every science, every math, anything that has to do with our knowledge as a people comes from Africa. But it was never called Africa. We had Kemet, we had Ghana, we had Mali Empire, we had the Egyptian Empire, we had empires throughout human history that achieved marvels that we can still not explain until today, 2021. But as the Romans were very, trying to conquer the rest of the world, and they kept trying to conquer North Africa, they were not successful for a very long time. And it took Scipio Africanus, and there's a debate as to whether their family name was already Africanus or the free people of Northern Africa as they conquered them took their name. Those are two hypotheses that I've heard, but Scipio Africanus beat Hannibal, the greatest military general in human history from Africa. He finally beat him. If anybody watched the movie Gladiator, they reenact the Battle of Carthage to show this great battle. It's something that the Romans lived over and over. They gave all the glory to Scipio Africanus and the Africanus family. And therefore today, we call the land Africa. As an African American, you call yourself by the name of two white Italian men, Amerigo Vespucci and Scipio Africanus. What do these men have to do with you and your ancestors? And why is that a choice as a label for either nationality or ethnicity or race when it's neither of the above? We could go as far as saying that African American is an ethnicity because it is a cultural grouping, and it is not a uniform cultural grouping, because if I am from South Africa and I move to America and I have a family and a business and I own property and I start to have generations, guess what? Even if I'm light of skin, I could be from Algeria, Libya, Egypt, anywhere in North Africa, be light of skin, move to the Americas, and I am an African American. So African Americans could be white. I thought African Americans were black. But you notice that I didn't say white or black yet, right? I'm talking about the actual standards of words that were used. Caucasian, Native American, African, Asian, and now we'll go to Hispanic. Hispanic is about one of the most racist, in regards to scientific racism, terminologies that a group of people could use upon themselves. Hispanic comes from Hispania, which is present-day countries of Portugal and Spain. Anyone that is a descendant of someone who speaks Castellano. Spain has a lot of different dialects. If anybody that speaks Spanish heard a Gallego speak from Spain, you don't understand what they're saying. Andalucense, you don't understand what they're saying. Castellano, I can understand a very small dialect in the country of Spain that propagated itself throughout the Americas. And as an identity, for those of us that are Afro-Indio descendants, refer to our identity by what we call Madre España or Mother Spain. I thought we had Mother Africa. I thought we had Mother Indigenousness to the Americas in this land. Why, out of all the identity labels that we can choose, do we align ourselves with Madre España. Now, if we said that Spanish-speaking countries, and it's very funny, and I'm gonna pull up a map real quick. Actually, I think there's a, it's an exclusive identity, right? And why do I say that? If I'm looking at it here on the world map, this one's also exclusive because we have some land like Colorado, Texas, California, Nuevo Mexico, and any of the southern states of the United States that were Mexico and were native. So Mexicans are Native Americans, y'all, all right? So which was native indigenous land going south of the border. Now we have Cuba, but then Haiti, no. Jamaica, no. Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, the West Indies, no. Guyana, Suriname, no. Brazil, literally 1/3 of the whole Latin America is not Hispanic. But then if you look at the populations, Belize is also not. If I look at the populations of these countries, what skin color do they tend to have? Black. Jamaicans, Haitians, Guyanese, Suriname, Brazilian. Hispanic is a very, very exclusive terminology. It was not invented by Hispanic people. It was invented by the Reagan administration in order to categorize people who spoke Spanish. Think about this, family. Our ancestors, as a Puerto Rican, my ancestors, when they went to war, they screamed Boricua to their death. Fast forward, I don't have any tie to my indigenousness. Some random man named Ronald Reagan stood up and said, you are defined as, didn't Trump just do that with Black History Month? The other steps in and defines you. And when we talk about personal power, empowerment, identity, and the necessity behind the power in these constructs, you must be able to define yourself. If at any point you leave the door open for anyone to walk in and define you for you, they will always have power over you. Because what you identify with, your body responds with automatically. This is why we call it identity. When we look at the breakdown of the etymology of identity, your subconscious being, your id entity. Whatever you learn from such and you put in the back of your mind. I'll give you an example. When I was in the 8th grade, I had just came from Puerto Rico. My English teacher asked me where I was from. I said Puerto Rican. She was a substitute. She was a Black woman too. She said, oh, you cut people, right? I'm a young kid. I'm 13. So in my head, I go, we do? So guess what I carried throughout high school? 2 knives. I'm 13. My mind is impressionable. That's my teacher. And she just told me that as a Puerto Rican, that what we do is we cut people. And she wasn't white. So it could come from any color, any creed, any religion, I don't care who it is, they can have the ability to get in your mind and program you to act in ways that have nothing to do with you or your ancestry. All right. Now we go to Latino, and people like to go back and forth between the two, but Latino comes from Latium or Latinus or King Latinum, who was the king of the Latins. The Latins were a people who founded the city of Rome. Why, as a Puerto Rican, would I call myself by the name of a people in history that I have absolutely nothing to do with? That was already a culture and a people and a language that has nothing to do with me and my ancestors. And the only reason the term Latino was invented was because the French were trying to gain more power during colonization. A French anthropologist called it Latin Amerique in order to open up and have French have access. If anybody wants to know the story between the division of Haiti and DR, go read into that story, right? The Treaty of Tortuga, right? Latinus or the Latin people have nothing to do with us. We call ourselves by a dead language. Out of all the things I could call myself by, I might as well want to make sure that it's alive and I can use it. Latin is a dead language. The music that we perform is not in Latin, therefore it is not called Latin music. It is not called Latin food because the people from Italy that are Latins did not make that food. And now I'm stretching it, right, family? Because I'm saying denounce it all. Because if they don't have meaning, what's the point of using it? In our understanding, in our mind, I don't care what society, we could talk about structural racism. We could talk about all the institutions that oppress. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about you. I'm talking about how you internalize this information and how is it that you can become empowered. All right. So therefore, with understanding, race is not real. It is not real genetically. It is not real in person. It is only real in the mind. And these are words. They don't have power on their own. Whiteness is not a power on its own. White supremacy is not a power on its own. If I sit here and I say white supremacists are making my life impossible, then what am I doing? I'm giving power to white supremacy. If I'm always going to reference who me and my people are in respect to the relationship of the other, because that's the only reason we use black, brown, yellow, and red. It was their way of identifying us outside of our ancestral indigenous names. Why would I use it? All right? Because we can have a stance about something, right? People do it all the time. I do it with Christians. I do it with Muslims. I do it with gay people. I don't care what your identity label is. If you have not studied and understood why that identity label applies to you and internalized it for yourself, you give power to the other. So if I stand on something and I challenge your stance, it's like I'm pulling the rug out of under your feet. If you ain't got nothing to hold you underneath, you feel like you will drown, which is why most wars are caused by people who think that they're different from other people. So much so that without the understanding of their own humanity or spirituality, they're willing to go as far in the name of God and Jesus and Muhammad and Buddha and kill and commit genocide upon the world. So if these words were power on their own, then we wouldn't have those realities. And because none of these things are explained to us as we're developing as young people, we grow up to be adults using empty simulacrums as a means of identifying our spirits on this earth. Now, it's not just for, pardon my French, shits and giggles, family. There are studies showing this. If you ever want to read Malcolm Gladwell, his book Blink, if you haven't read it, please check it out. It speaks about subconscious being and identity, right? And in this book, they cited a study where they took a group of African Americans with the same academic qualifications, split them up in two groups. So they each had the same probability to pass this academic exam. Group number one, they gave them the test. They came back with the scores and got an average. Group number two, they gave them the test, but put a sheet of paper on top and asked, are you black, yes or no? That group all circled yes and scored 50% lower than the first group. How is that possible? I literally took a pen and circled something, and it literally impacted the way I performed on a test. When I learned this, I was really thinking about it because I myself felt empowered by learning my own history and my culture. And I said, I wonder if that group of people, I already knew what the association was. When they circled black, they thought they were inferior because nobody gave them any foundation that black was power, black was beautiful, black was intelligent. The constant status quo narrative is the opposite of it. And if you don't have any framework to give you the power behind it, all you have to listen to is the negativity about who you are. And when you put yourself in a position to perform, you will sabotage to meet the expectation. Think about that, family. You in business meetings, you're negotiating, you're trying to buy a property, you're trying to organize the community. How does that work using race? All right. So for me, I understood that we are living in a lot of mental prisons, that we have generational traumas that were passed down, and that we still have chains attached from such generational traumas. And because what we believe and what we think tends to manifest in our physical reality, I thought to myself, what better way to test any of this on than people who manifested prison in their lives. Because it meant that in their mind, they were imprisoned. All right. So I wrote and proposed a curriculum to the Department of Corrections in Hudson County, New Jersey. The curriculum that I wrote is called Cultural and Social Conscious Education, following a blending of Eastern and Western philosophies, self-actualization, understanding of mind, body, emotions, community, culture, and answering the questions what, who, when, where, and why am I? If you cannot answer what, who, when, where, then you cannot answer why. And the why is the most important question you need to answer for yourself. Why? Because for those of us that don't find our why, the extreme is suicide. And I'm speaking from experience. My father took his own life because he couldn't find his why. And for as long as we had this conversation, there are people around the United States and the world that took their own lives because they could not find their why. Now, if I'm walking into a prison and into a jail where you have a whole group of massive people who tend to statistically be melanated, who tend to speak different languages other than English, happen to find themselves in such a state of despair, how could I ever help them find their why? All right. So I took that on. So since the year 2013, I've been working with our incarcerated brothers and sisters. I've learned a tremendous amount of information and experience based on we all listen and hear about the justice system from the outside. If you ain't never done time, or you don't know anybody that's ever done time, you would never understand the subworld that exists in the United States of America. And when we look at local budgets, I guarantee if you look in PA, Pennsylvania spends over $1 billion in order to incarcerate a very few amount of people in respect to the population. And most of those happen to be men of color. See, here in Hudson County, we spend $29,000 a year per student in the Board of Education, but we'll spend $83,000 a year in order to keep them incarcerated. So we hear this information and it goes over our heads. Nobody stands up when they see a politician or they see a representative and say, excuse me, why do you spend 3 times more on locking them up than putting them through school? Because whatever the structures and standards that came from then are expressed until now. The crossing between scientific racism and classism happened during the passing of the 13th Amendment. Because 680,000 Americans lost their lives fighting for and against slavery. And when we say, what is slavery? When you're forced to work for another and another makes profit off of you. The status of slavery can be perpetual. If you were born from a mother who was a slave, you yourself were a slave. You had no rights, you had no freedom, and if you did get your freedom, you had to carry a piece of paper around to show that you did that. And let me ask y'all something, family. Ain't that the same thing we're doing today? Are we not splitting families up at the border on stage like they did in 1864? Are we not putting babies in cages like they did then when they didn't want the babies to crawl away? So they put little shackles around their little baby feet around a tree? The conditions and the standards of slavery then never ended, just transformed up until today. And all the 13th Amendment did was take away propertization of the body to individuals and then gave it to the state. Therefore, when you are arrested and convicted, you become property of the state. You are no longer a human being. We are one of the few, I think there's only 2 or 3 countries in the whole world that has legalized constitutional-based slavery. Because the 13th Amendment says slavery and involuntary servitude are illegal except if something is abolished, there's no except as punishment for a crime where a party have been duly convicted in the United States and all of its territories. So when I look here in New Jersey and I'm looking at, say, the city of Hoboken, and they put their budget up on the screen during their Zoom budget call, and they said that 85% of the city's budget goes to public safety. And out of that 85%, 90% goes to salary. The whole budget? That's almost a whole budget. Hoboken is one of the wealthiest cities in the United States. But all of the money goes towards public safety. Public safety ain't just cops on the street. Public safety is cops, EMTs, firemen, detectives, prosecutors, judges, halfway houses, prisons, jails, outpatient programs, inpatient programs, medically based assisted therapy. I mean, literally a multi-billion-dollar industry from beginning to the end. And for any one of these men that you see in this picture that went through it, so much money was made off of their body. But then you throw them out into the street and there's no money for them. This is the system we live in 2021. 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's inmates. If we're going to talk structural racism, we have to speak about mass incarceration. We have to speak about the disenfranchisement from the vote. We have to speak about the removal of human and civil rights from any individual who gets convicted of a crime. Because we're one of the few countries in the world that does it. And to me, in the land of the free, as an American, it is literally one of the biggest stains on our shirt. It is embarrassing to me. So what can we do? I'm working with incarcerated people, which most people would think and would write them off, that they're nobody. I found a lot of beautiful men and women behind these bars. I found a lot of talent behind these bars. I found a lot of I've gotten more intelligent input from these men and women in the jail than I get from my college students in college. We know and understand the dynamic. For anyone that's read, go look up statistics as to what kind of populations find themselves behind bars. And not just for crime, we're also speaking ICE and detention of illegal, quote unquote, illegal immigrants in this country. If anybody ever wanted to challenge whether structural racism existed, just go point at a jail. Because here you would only have two arguments. One of them, which was the argument that they proposed then, which the first movie ever made in US history, Birth of a Nation, was about the criminalization of a black man. Why? Because the 13th Amendment said that if you can convict them, you can make them a slave again. It never changed. It never changed. 2021, 13th Amendment still has the loophole. So as I'm running this information, I'm also teaching them this information. And I'm letting them know this is your status. Frederick Douglass, when he wrote in his book that he was traded to the new slave master, Mr. Auld in Baltimore. Mr. Auld only had him as a slave. Mr. Auld worked all day. The wife was home and she couldn't believe that a young boy, she really got a liking to Mr. Douglass, didn't know how to read, so she started teaching him how to read. The husband comes home early from work one day, sees the wife teaching Frederick how to read, and blacks out on her. You can't teach a slave how to read. They'll learn that they're slaves. And then they will become, quote unquote, unmanageable and untractable. So when you teach someone of their status, then they can do something about it. But for a lot of our men and women behind bars, they don't understand their status. All they're doing is going up in front of a court who's asking them to take a plea. 96% of people that go up in court take the plea. 98% of elected prosecutors in the United States of America are white. Here in Hudson County, 90% of people in detention are black and brown. 75% of people on probation in New Jersey are black. 90% of juveniles waived up as adults in the justice system are black. Two arguments. One, that blackness makes you a criminal. Genetically speaking, blackness or brownness or any melanin or speaking of the tongue makes you automatically want to behave like a criminal. The other explanation, this is a racist ass system. And we know that the first one ain't it. Because we know that there's bad people in every creed, every color, every race. And we know that there's beautiful people in the same manner. But if we start using race as the focal point, and I'm saying it here, Hudson County, Mr. Febo, can you please help us try to figure out how can we reduce disproportionate minority contact with the justice system? So when here in Jersey City, they're saying, we want to increase police presence. Where are they doing it? In downtown? Are they going to go to the nice neighborhood and increase police presence? And this is what I mean about being real, family. When someone's telling you that, say, oh, you mean in the black neighborhood, right? where you think the crime is. So if you happen to increase the amount of police found in a neighborhood, are you not going to increase the amount of arrests? Aren't you going to increase the amount of convictions? Are you going to increase the amount of people that go from school to prison for the school to prison pipeline? Here in Jersey City, they can say that by the 3rd grade, they can already tell which boys are going to prison. So racism as an ideology, racism as a psychology, racism as a social interaction, and then racism as an institution. And the biggest form of it is the carceral system. Now, we have the ability, there was a lawsuit in the state of New York for a hospital's algorithm for intake being racist. Now you don't need people to be racist. You need one coder to put in racist coding in a program, and the entire institution will respond as such. Now we fast forward. For me, for any of the adults that I've worked with, men and women, and then later on I started working with the juveniles. About a year later, since about 2014, I've been working with juveniles in juvenile detention. Family, for me, this is like literally one of the toughest things. I've like sometimes just broke down crying in random places because I walk in these buildings and I see babies in chains. I see babies in cells. I see babies trying to behave like grown men would behave inside of those buildings. Babies. I got 5 children, family. I was just working with a juvenile who's 11 in jail. And we're arguing with the judge. Who puts an 11-year-old in jail? And the judge told us, I'm the judge, I'm the ultimate say, I don't care. He hung up on us. Because the system is worked to function that way. You think an 11-year-old being in that jail is going to create any progress in his life? We already know the incarceration system is not a deterrent for crime. The carceral system contributes to homelessness and hunger, displacement, broken families, and the very, very astute ability for private corporations to take advantage of the pockets of these families by making phone calls $5 a minute, by making a pack of ramen noodle soups $2. And when you got 1,000 people in a building, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of money that's being made. All right. So in that understanding, to see it go from the youngest to go to the oldest, that we live in a system that has opportunities present itself where the system will dehumanize a child. To me, the ultimate test, the ultimate marker of a society is the way a society treats its children, because they're the purest thing that we know. And if you look at a child, I say this to educators all the time, you're looking at a student and the first thing that pops in your mind is their color or their tongue or where you think they're from, you shouldn't be an educator. Because as an educator, you would understand that we rise way above that. If I'm going to use my anchoring of my identity in my spirit, then that means the only way I can anchor you is in your spirit. Spirit got no color. Spirit got no tongue. Spirit got no way of behaving other and moving than in love. So when I approach a student that way, and I'm saying it for kids of color, and I'm saying it for white children, because we'll put a bunch of white children in a room and let people of color who are even adults, even in the back of their mind, say, look at these little white ass kids. Like, what do they know? But when you're talking to 14-year-old white children, as I have in mass audiences, it's not cute to think that way. They're still babies. They don't know any better. Any teenagers at that age still can't formalize the identity. It's an idea. How is it in that for them in practice? It could never be. Not until they get older. And who do they have in their ears teaching them this stuff? Teachers, principals, parents, community leaders, all talking about this, feeding them the information. So if we want to end racism, the only way we could end racism is through white people. Black people, y'all can't end racism. Latino people, y'all can't end racism. We do have it. But when we talk about the structure behind it, only white people can do that. Why? Because in the structure of itself, the illusion of superiority was innate. So it only takes people who stand in that structure to remind the rest of them that it is not a structure that stands in superiority. And I've seen it with my own eyes. White people become more receptive to conversations about race from other white people, the same way cops do, right? I can't go up to, I start talking to a cop about police brutality, they tell me to shut up, that I don't know what I'm talking about because I'm not a cop. So I go grab a cop, I bring him in front and let them talk. And now he'll listen. White people have a huge responsibility behind this. And it doesn't mean that you have to feel guilty. We get into conversations about white privilege. There's a lot of white people that don't have privilege. If you think privilege is being able to walk in somewhere, whoop-de-woo. There are more poor white people than there are poor rich people, rich white people. There are more poor white people combined in the US of America than there are Black and Latino poor people. So it has nothing to, it never had anything to do with race. It always had to do with class. And if you want to see that from the foundation of this country, look up Bacon's Rebellion, right? That's the first time whiteness was defined in law, and it had nothing to do with you being born here. It had to do if you came from Britain. Only British men coming over here were considered white. That was the first legal code definition of whiteness. Then we fast forward, and they defined it as free white persons. Look it up, Black's Law Dictionary, free white persons. And in it, it says anyone from North Africa, Moors, Greeks, Romans, anyone from Europe. And if anybody knows true European history, you know that there were Black kings and queens, Black nobility. There was all kinds of colors in the power structures of Europe. Europe is not a white, was never a white-based society. Not up until recently. White skin, fair skin was first of all born in Africa. The first white alleles came out in Africa. So whiteness was born in Africa from Black mothers. So if you happen to be white, your great-great-great-great-great-grandmother was a Black woman. How could you be racist? We all come from the same ancestors. And for anyone to stand up and say, this racial categorization is a species. That's what they wanted you to think. White people are species, Black people are species, Latino people are species, and we know, according to human law and natural law, that is impossible. All right? So, when asked your race, right, and I do this all the time, I go up to people and I say, what's the difference between a human right and a civil right? And most people can't answer. We don't understand the connection between our nationality and natural law. Why? Because it is represented in international law. So what is your nationality to give you access to human rights? Human rights stand above the Constitution of the United States of America. So first and foremost, I must dig my feet in identity as a human being. Then I could talk about everything else, all right? And declaring yourself as such, and I'm going to show you why this is important, family. This is a U.S. Census demographic breakdown as of when is this? As of 2019. And here we say race and Hispanic origin. All right, family? Sorry, I'm trying to make this a little bigger. White alone, if y'all want to do the math, for those of you that are writing down, white alone, it says here that the United States of America is 76.3% white. Y'all live in the US, right? Like, just on that alone, I've traveled all over the US. When I first saw that number, I was like, impossible. Impossible. 3 out of 4 people are white? Impossible. Right? Here then it says Black or African American alone, 13% of the population. So we're already at 89, family. Asian alone, 6%. 2 or more races, 2.8%. How ridiculous is that? Every single one of us is 2 or more races. Every single one of us. But we only have 2.8% of the people in the United States declared as biracial. Then we have Hispanic or Latino at 18%. So we're already over the 100, right, family? Now it says here, white alone, not Hispanic or Latino, 60%. How did they get that math? Why does it say white alone, 76%, white alone, not Hispanic, 60%? What is this 76 referring to? It is including Hispanics, because when you look at the census question, is this, it says right here, family, please, this is a census question. Please answer both question 8 about Hispanic origin and question 9 about race. For this census, Hispanic origins are not races. Then it says, are you Hispanic, then Mexican, then American, then Puerto Rican, then Cuban, etc. Then it says, what is this person's race? White, black, American Indian. And then when you look at all the other categorizations that they give you for race, Chinese, Filipino, Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese are not races. Look at how ridiculous this is. So I checked that I'm Puerto Rican, and then I don't know any better. I'm like, oh, well, my skin is white, so I'm going to check white. As a matter of fact, whether it be the Equal Opportunity Employment Office, anything dealing with affirmative action, or any demographic question, if you check the box other, you're counted as white. So you got a bunch of Hispanic people checking that they're white, but we also have a bunch of Hispanic people checking that they're black. Then how come we don't see Hispanic black? So all they're doing is asking us a bunch of questions, declaring ourselves in a racial status so as to give the appearance. Less than 10% of the world population is white, family. The white allele is only 6,000 years old. And over the course of time, whiteness will start to fade as human beings keep intermingling. When you listen to white supremacists speak, they speak from fear that the white race is going to quote unquote die. Meanwhile, you see white women having children with black men and have some beautiful ass babies. So, and we're going to follow the ideals of what the system and the structure is providing, which is saying the concept of whiteness and white alone is 76% of the population of the United States, when we all know that damn well ain't true. But this is the government telling us that. This is the Census Bureau telling us that, and every single one of us participate in it. Why? Because if when you check that census, you're worth $2,000 in that overall budget. And if anybody filled the census, did they ask you any other questions other than your race? So if you don't know where this comes from, please look up the eugenic societies. The eugenic societies created the first birthing banking database, where they went around asking people what their race was and if they had disabilities, because they were known as the undesirables. Then they entered into contract with the Board of Education of many of the states around the country in order to implement race-based questions when admitting people into an institution. Why? Because they wanted to know who was desirable and who wasn't. Look it up, family. It's all over YouTube, all over Google. That's the only reason we're asked these questions. None of these questions allude to our humanity. None of these questions allude to our civility. All right? With that being said, when we etymology the word community, it means to communicate unity. All right? And that's the only way we're going to do that. A lot of our youth are speaking about safe spaces. A lot of our students are speaking about being able to speak and declare yourself. And I'm talking white people, I'm talking black people, I'm talking everybody. We all need spaces in order to have these conversations, to become as real as we can and get to a conclusion and a resolution. Not speak in circles, not speak about, we get into suffering Olympics. Oh, nah, my ancestors suffer more than your ancestors. Meanwhile, you don't even know where your ancestors came from. We generalize the story about who we are, and what we have to start doing is understanding that we all stand on one ground. And the more we communicate that, the more you are able to create a sense of community. As I've been running the programming in the jail, Not only are the men and the women super receptive to the information, like I'm giving you guys, I give to them, but it also had an impact on their behavior. It also had an impact on their recidivism. Recidivism means to come back into jail. We have the national recidivism rate is at 79%, meaning 80%, almost 80% of people who get out of jail will come back in. And as they went through my education, I have an 8.3. 8.3 people out of 300 that I serviced last year came back into jail. Meanwhile, the counties was at 74. So I know through experience, through the implementation over the past 8 years into the system, working with ICE detainees, working with correctionals, the correctional officers, working with the health departments, I've gotten a pretty good scope. And I'm telling y'all, family, what I found that what I'm introducing has really created change because it gives us a different stance when to discuss and how to create negotiations towards remedy. Because at the end of the day, family, there has to be remedy. And what does that remedy look like? It's not just money alone. It ain't just reparations by itself. If they turn around and give a whole bunch of community organizations $1 million each, and those community organizations are not organized themselves, they're going to lose the money. So it ain't just money, it's structure, it's business, it's organization, it's financial backing, it's being able to support each other. And when we start supporting communities that are oppressed, which tend to be of color, even though we have white oppressed communities, then you start alleviating. And I'm going to give an example and I'll close it out with that. Here, and if you do your research, how much does a murder cost? From when the shots are fired, to the police respond, to the EMTs, to the forensics, to taken to the jail, to getting to the prosecutor and the judge and going to jail, going to prison, spending the time in prison, all the food and all the communications and the family and the single mother because the father's in jail, taking care of her kids by herself, so she needs welfare and social assistance. Add all that money together, and the average goes up to $19 million per murder. So here I'm saying in Jersey City, we're averaging about 35 to 40 murders per year. So if community got together and organized and prevented 10 murders, how much money is there left now? And then when we go to government and we say, can you give money for a domestic violence program? Because there are none around and a lot of our women are suffering. And they go, well, why do we always have to pay for that? We don't really have the money. Excuse me? When you start breaking down budgets and you start seeing that anything in the richest country in the world that we need as a people can be subsidized, can be paid for, and will create long-term effects upon a community. The thing is that when these solutions are offered, they're never taken advantage of, again, because community needs support. So an institution like Lehigh Community College can provide a lot of support to a lot of brothers and sisters and families in your immediate area who we all know are suffering. So what would that even look like? How could we organize, right? What a reality could look like is something that we need to declare so that we can live into it. But most of our institutions, especially in academia, we get stuck in the academia and the intellectuality of discussing the problems and never bring a solution. And these solutions ain't hard. Hugging someone, feeding someone, putting clothes on their back and a roof on their head. Those are very easy solutions. But if we're not having those discussions, then they're never going to be real. And we could be academics all day, PhD, administrator, I don't care. If you're not contributing solution, then your role is moot. Because why? We are an institution with higher knowledge and higher education and information. It is our responsibility to do that. All right. So to communicate unity, and I'll leave you all with this. In order to be empowered, one must understand the power and the right behind self-declaration. That is your power, family. I really hope you own it. I really hope you understand that you have that power at any given moment in time and that you never give that power away for anyone on this earth. All right, family. With much love and I'll leave it open for any questions you guys may have.